Welcome to the lecture series of Public Theology, a cooperation of the Berlin Institute for Public Theology, the Bayers-Now D Center for Public Theology, and the Lutheran World Federation.
Hello, I'm Dr. Esther McIntosh. I work at York St John University in the UK. I teach feminist ethics and public theology because discrimination and violence against women and girls is widespread. Moreover, theology has taught complementarianism and the submission of women, and public theology needs to challenge this. This lecture focuses on gender and sexuality in the context of public theology. Gender includes the designation of male and female and the social construction of masculinity and femininity. Sexuality refers to all sexualities included under the LGBTQ+ umbrella. In this lecture, you will learn how the concept of God as male excludes women, how the motif of sacrifice is dangerous for women, how to challenge heterosexist theology, and how this is all relevant to public theology. Christianity, especially in the global north, has a long tradition of speaking and thinking of God as male. Liturgies, hymns, and prayers speak of God using male terminology, using he pronouns, and with characteristics of power and strength. God is Lord, King, and Father. God the Father is portrayed as a personal God, and historically, Christianity has divided persons into the binary categories of male and female. Consequently, the notion of God the Father means that God has been perceived as male, and as part of this maleness, God is described using masculine traits. God the Father is a fierce, authoritarian, ideal patriarch. In addition, a personal father can only be God by being transcendent, and the transcendent aspects of God are also equated with traditionally male metaphors. God the Father is rational rather than emotional. God is impassible. Why does this matter? When God is portrayed as male, men are elevated in society as being closer to or representing God in a way that women are not and cannot. Women have very little to identify with. In other words, the authoritarian characterization of God the Father has led to the dominance of white, rich males over everyone and everything else. The male is equated with reason and the mind, the female with emotion and the body. This has been used as the grounds for men to dominate women, and to claim that this is the natural order, divinely ordained. To support this view, the Christian tradition has emphasized the creation story in the 2nd chapter of the book of Genesis in the Bible. In this passage, woman is created after man and from man. But there is another version of the creation story in the book of Genesis which suggests equality. In chapter 1, man and woman are created at the same time, and both are created in the image of God. We could emphasize this version of the creation story and promote equality between men and women rather than hierarchy. Can we also revise the concept of God so that women have something to identify with? If God is actually male, then there is little we can do to change the image of God or the elevated status this gives men in religion. If, however, the image of God as Father is a metaphor, then we can change it, especially if other metaphors are more appropriate. So we need to ask, is God actually male? In Christianity, the term God refers to a transcendent being, not contained by space and time, and not possessing a human body. God is not therefore male or female in the human sense. But when we imagine God as male, we believe that God is male. The pronoun he is a metaphor, so it is negotiable, and we need to demythologize the male institution of God and propose alternatives of inclusive language. The symbol of God will always remain an open question. The problem is that one group of one species has claimed a monopoly on its description. Equality between men and women, therefore, requires different metaphors. It might be tempting to add female or feminine metaphors as a corrective to the male and masculine ones, and so as to include images with which women can identify. But adding female imagery to dominant male imagery only operates as an add-on, an optional extra. It doesn't change the dominant male metaphors. It doesn't rebalance the hierarchy of male and female. The status quo remains intact. Also, female and feminine metaphors, such as the example of the biblical image of the hen gathering her chicks found in the books of Psalms and Matthew, reinforce a gender stereotype, suggesting that women are more nurturing than men and that mothering is their primary purpose. This isolates the childless and infertile women. How can we solve the problem of the exclusion of women from the maleness of God? The Christian community is made up of men and women, and we need to represent both. We could use God as Father and God as Mother if we had equality in society, but since we don't, we need a gender-transcendent concept of God. For example, we could speak of God as a supreme agent, still a personal God, still transcendent and active, one who has agency to act in the world, but not necessarily in an able-bodied sense. We need a concept of God that is able to be imagined in ways appropriate for all marginalised groups, whether female, black, or disabled. So, how does the concept of God relate to the motif of sacrifice? The uncritical use of masculine God language has been used to legitimize domineering male behavior. Discrimination, abuse, and violence against women and girls is widespread in Christian communities as well as in wider society. Moreover, the emphasis on sacrifice and forgiveness in Christianity has been used to encourage women to stay with and pray for abusive partners. The Christian Bible and the Christian tradition have valued and promoted self-sacrifice as a means to salvation. In the Bible, in the book of Exodus, the ancient Hebrews sacrificed food, drink, and animals to atone for wrongdoing. In the New Testament, sacrifice is less literal and more spiritual, following the ultimate sacrifice of Christ on the cross to atone for human sin. In both cases, sacrifice is intended to restore the relationship between a holy God and a sinful humanity. The Gospel of John states that sacrificing one's life is the ultimate sacrifice, thus promoting the idea of sacrifice as ideal, as emulating the example of Christ. Martyrs have been revered in Christian history. The steadfastness of one's faith is thus demonstrated by the offering of oneself and the silent or uncomplaining endurance of suffering. Feminist theology criticizes this emphasis on sacrifice because it is detrimental to all oppressed groups, those discriminated against on the basis of race, sex, and so on, and it is especially damaging to women because of passages in the Bible that have been used to support the subordination of women. For example, the book of Ephesians states, "Wives, be subject to your husbands." This passage also tells husbands to love their wives, but only after establishing a hierarchical structure that places women lower than men, which encourages male dominance and female submission. Hence, the language of sacrifice further legitimizes the power of the dominant class and encourages the subordinate class to sacrifice themselves to the powerful out of a duty to their religion. Women are frequently expected and required to make sacrifices for the benefit of their families and their religious community. In a society in which men have authority over women, women sacrifice themselves to serve their husbands and church leaders. In other words, a religion which equates faith with self-sacrifice leads to the passive acceptance of suffering, and in a patriarchal society where men hold more of the power, it is women who suffer. By emphasizing humble obedience, self-giving, and self-denial, Christianity has glorified sacrificial suffering. It has minimized pain. This is dangerous because it can be used to legitimize abusive relationships. Both the notion that suffering is divine and the notion that suffering is caused by sin result in silent endurance of pain, either in the hope of salvation or as a deserved punishment. This serves to validate the oppression of women and other marginalized groups, and it fails to challenge those using their power to abuse, humiliate, and control. We can change the emphasis on sacrifice if we find that the interpretation of it has been distorted. The primary message of the New Testament is one of friendship rather than service. In the Gospel of John, Jesus refers to the disciples as friends rather than servants. While servants act out of duty and have to place the needs of the master above their own, friendships are characterized by mutual care and concern. The passage in the Gospel of John that refers to sacrificing one's life as the ultimate sacrifice could be interpreted as emphasizing the value of life rather than promoting self-effacement. In a society where women are conditioned to consider others' needs before their own, this is a helpful corrective to a life of subordination and self-sacrifice. The image of the cross remains central to Christianity, so we cannot escape the motifs of suffering and sacrifice altogether. Is it possible then to retain this without passive acceptance of abuse and oppression? Can we develop an account of self-love that avoids self-obsession and respects the autonomy and well-being of those inclined to be overly sacrificial? We could do this by focusing on the concept of justice in relationships. Justice requires equality rather than dominance and subordination. Just relations enable mutual flourishing where each person has the freedom to be themselves, where each person in the relationship respects the other, and no one is feared, manipulated, or suppressed. Love for the self and the other means not acquiescing to all demands. Some sacrifice in relationships is inevitable, but it should be temporary, freely chosen, and shared out, with the aim of valuing all persons and enabling all to realize their potential. The image of suffering on the cross is profound. Instead of being used to endorse abuse, it should move us to respond to the suffering of others and to seek an end to oppression. A further consequence of the image of God as male is to represent the church as female, God as he, and the church as she. This contrast, however, rests on heteronormativity, the assumption that there is a gender binary of male and female, and that heterosexuality is the divinely preferred relationship for Christians. In turn, this leads to heterosexism, discrimination against those who are homosexual, bisexual, or queer, where queer encompasses a range of identities and sexualities under the LGBTQ+ umbrella, including transgender, intersex, and asexual persons, for example. The Christian tradition has promoted a version of God and sexuality that serves to maintain the power of elite men. As Christianity colonized indigenous people, it taught monogamous, heterosexual relationality and the submission of women to men, with femininity regarded as inferior and masculinity regarded as superior, so long as masculinity was displayed by men and not by women. Consequently, any persons engaged in polygamous or homosexual relationships, or fluid in their gender identity, were regarded as deviant, sinful, and punishable by God. To counter this colonial and patriarchal order, we need a different understanding of God and of sexuality, an understanding that challenges the overemphasis on transcending our bodies and desires, and that acknowledges that we are and have bodies. This means developing a theology of sensual experience and finding the presence of God outside of heterosexual relationships. The exclusion of LGBTQ+ persons by the Church requires us to rethink the structures of church and the way theology presents and understands love, not just in theory, but as an activity, as love in action. The Christian tradition has assumed a universal and normative understanding of sexuality and of expressions of love, but that understanding is not at all universal. It is not inclusive. It is the position of the white, able-bodied, cisgendered, heterosexual male. Queer theology, the queering of heterosexual theology, does not take place at the centre of power then, but at the margins. The political and sexual queering of theology seeks diversity and plurality. This is a political and a theological activity. Queer theology analyses the construction of sexuality and reflects on the pluralities and fluidities of sexual and gender identities. By deconstructing the heterosexual assumptions of theology, queer theology brings to light a suppressed face of God, a God in whom gender and sexuality are fluid. Queer theology is rooted in solidarity with the excluded and is committed to social justice. It is an agent for transformation. It draws on the Christian notion of the incarnation, God in flesh, to speak of bodies and desires. By employing the biblical passage in Galatians that states, "In Christ there is neither male nor female," it is able to think beyond gender binaries. Traditional theology has used the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in the book of Genesis to condemn homosexuality, but the story depicts an instance of male rape rather than one of love. By contrast, the book of Song of Songs describes and celebrates consensual love and desire. This can be reread and interpreted as a text for any lovers. Queer theology is a theology of sex, sex as an act of human intimacy and of deep spiritual love in the presence of God. To talk of God as father or mother is still an expression of heterosexuality. A queer God is a God of love that disrupts the idealization of heterosexuality. Sexual equality for all means moving beyond condemnation and moving beyond tolerance to the full acceptance and affirmation of LGBTQ+ persons in the Church and as loved by God, so as to enable their spiritual and moral enrichment. How do these issues of God language, sacrifice, and heterosexism relate to public theology? Public theology is rooted in a perceived need for theology to interact with public issues in the church, the academy, and society. The term public, however, disguises who is included and who has access. As we have seen in this lecture, women and LGBTQ+ persons have often been excluded on the grounds of gender and sexuality. Public theology, then, must question who holds power and authority in public spheres. Men tend to interrupt women more than women interrupt men. Men tend to speak for longer than women and to ignore women's suggestions. Furthermore, if public is contrasted with private, issues such as domestic violence are dismissed from attention. They are not considered legitimate subjects of interest. Public theology needs to broaden its understanding of who counts and what matters. It needs to engage in serious theological discourse on issues relating to gender and sexuality, and the effects of theology upon them. If theology is discriminatory and does not allow for full agency or human flourishing, it needs to change. Public theology needs to rectify exclusion and discrimination and to promote inclusion and liberation. If public theology only listens to the dominant voices, it only hears selectively. If it draws primarily on biblical interpretation by elite men, it supports the dominant class and ignores the exclusion of women and LGBTQ+ persons. Public theology needs to hear the voices of the subordinated and marginalized. It needs to expand its understanding of the image of God to include the full range of genders and sexualities. Public theology needs to critique theological teaching on the subservience of women and on binary categories of gender. It needs to critique theological representations of maleness and assumptions of heterosexuality. Otherwise, privilege and dominance remain unchanged. Public theology needs to amend historical privilege and broaden access to the public sphere by calling out misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia in theology and in the church. It needs to support the development of new liturgies and rituals that represent the full equality and humanity of all persons. Since public theology is concerned with uniting a variety of publics for the benefit of the common good, it ought to be concerned with inclusion. If some groups are excluded or marginalised on the grounds of gender or sexuality, the common good cannot be achieved. Hence, public theology needs to analyse the public expression of Christian faith and its impact on marginalised groups. For public theology to engage with social, political and spiritual issues, it needs an inclusive concept of community. As we have seen, the maleness of God leaves women cold. The concept of sacrifice legitimises the subordination of women and undermines the Church's ability to deal adequately with domestic violence. And heteronormative theologies exclude LGBTQ+ persons. Public theology needs to consider how it portrays women's role and responds to situations of abuse. It needs to rethink how it portrays normative relationships and the impact of this on LGBTQ+ persons. Public theology should not mean elite men doing theology in public, while others suffer in private, indoors and out of sight. Power in the home, in the church and in society are intertwined. In seeking to bridge the publics of church, academy and society, public theology will better serve the common good through solidarity with the marginalised and the oppressed, to redress inequalities and promote justice. You should now be able to explain how the concept of God as male excludes women, how the motif of sacrifice is dangerous for women, how to challenge heterosexist theology, and how this is all relevant to public theology.